Okay, good morning. Thank you for being here for this panel. I am here to present you the result of the work we have been developing to understand the therapeutic potential of ayahuasca by studying a group of users that went to a retreat experience at the Temple of the Way of Light in Peru. This main research was conducted at ICEERS and was coordinated by Debora Gonzalez. It was a piece of research supported by the Beckley Foundation, and the particular part of qualitative research that I am presenting today was conducted at the Faculty of Education and Psychology at the Catholic University of Portugal. So, our research participants, they integrated this broader research that was about long-term effects of the quality of life, well-being, and health of Western users. They all presented symptoms of complicated grief, PTSD, anxiety, depression that was measured in that research, and it showed over time a high impact of ayahuasca in the relief of those groups of symptoms. So we already knew about the initial benefits that the longitudinal data was showing us, and we took the opportunity to interview them immediately after the end of their retreats while they were still at the temple. So we were a team of researchers that was in different places in the world, but we were all coordinating to get these different levels of data. So we wanted specifically with our qualitative research to understand the specific psychological processes that emerged immediately after they finished their retreats. And we wanted to know about their perception of how was the experience benefiting them, what they had to say about how the plant was helping them. So we used qualitative phenomenological research that searches for the meanings underneath the participants' subjective experiences and interpretations, and we conducted semi-structured, in-depth interviewing that was, and we collected data next to an intentional sample of 31 participants. We developed then a semi-inductive thematic analysis. We used data analysis, qualitative data analysis software called NVivo 11. So this tool allows a very rigorous and systematic exploration of the content of the participants' experiences, while it still authorizes some creativity and some exploration that the researcher is still able to do about potentially new and emerging content that comes from the data while we're analyzing it. So why were we conducting this research? So the decision to use qualitative data, and we just heard about Hania's extensive research, so it's not exactly a new thing, but qualitative research is always a piece of evidence that's kind of overlooked. And we are now in this process in psychedelic renaissance that we are already pretty much aware about the benefits and extensive evidence that shows about the therapeutic potential, but we are sometimes challenged about how to understand how those processes operate with the people. So qualitative research can actually be of a great contribution to fill in that additional level of understanding about the results that all the clinical research and the more structured settings are pointing us to. So we had an initial work being done in the field of grief that already pointed out the fact that this group of people were expressing the benefits of their ayahuasca experiences in terms of emotional release, in terms of access to biographical memories, and in terms also of experiences of contact with the deceased. So this was an initial piece of research with a specific group, and we used qualitative research methods in in combination with other strategies, and this allowed, in fact, another level of understanding about those benefits. Other papers, a very recent one by José Carlos Bozo, for example, and his team, are pointing out about the fact that a lot of the ayahuasca experience can potentially be explained if we actually use psychological variables that are described in psychotherapies, and this can be a helpful language to understand the therapeutic effects of the brew. And even if qualitative research is not dominant or far from it in the field of evidence collection in this to try to understand the therapeutic potential, it is true, however, that already a number of studies are being conducted with other substances, namely psilocybin, LSD, that are exactly using additional research with a qualitative approach to add to those results. So our participants were a group of 31 people. 20 of them, so over 60%, were women. They were mostly aged between 21 and 40 years of age. Even if it was an international sample, let me just check the time. They were mostly from North America. They were highly educated, which meant that they either went to university, finished a degree, or had a PhD. They were mostly working. They had largely looked for a previous therapeutic intervention to achieve support for their symptoms. They had also, in almost half of the sample, used psychiatric medication at least once over their lifetime, and they also had received in the past a previous mental health diagnosis. So, at the first, in a first level, we wanted to understand what mental health problems and life events and significant life events motivated people to search for the ayahuasca experience. So they self-reported a number of mental illness history that had to do mostly with depression and anxiety, at a more moderate level with grief, trauma, and suicidal behavior, either in the form of ideation or attempts, and eating disorders, learning disabilities, and bipolar disorders. Other life events that were not so clinically expressive had to do with dysfunctional family dynamics, with work and relationship related problems, grief, immigration, etc. So we also tried to understand what previous therapies had they been using to find relief and what was their perception about their efficacy. They were trying holistic and alternative approaches mostly, which is interesting, which probably means that they had a big predisposition to find help through ayahuasca, but also more conventional approaches like medical approaches, psychotherapy, pharmacology, etc. And even if their perception about the efficacy of these tools was mostly effective, sometimes they couldn't avoid reporting the extensive amount of time over their lifetimes that these tools took to have a significant positive impact. So we decided to organize our results in terms of psychological processes that had to do mostly with cognitive dimensions, mostly with emotional dimensions or processes, mostly with spiritual and with body awareness processes. This distinction is, of course, a very artificial one because we know that well-being and health and happiness are not achieved by different compartments of a human being, but this is also probably another piece of evidence that can add to the fact that ayahuasca has all these complementary and holistic benefits. So we were finding that our participants were speaking mostly about, sorry, I forgot to pass this one, and this one. So our participants were mostly speaking about predominantly cognitive processes. And among these, the ones that we could see were highlighted the most were insight and awareness. We understood insight and awareness as the ability to develop an understanding about oneself that includes the awareness about where is the problem coming from. And 28 out of our 31 participants of the different groups were expressing this kind of content. Another level was acceptance. So acceptance was defined by us as the alternative to denial and avoidance, and where the person is actively and consciously able to accept life events, experiences, and feelings without trying to change them, to deny them, to ignore them. So these potentially traumatic life events that were associated with guilt could be now accepted without that burden. And this was happening for 24 out of the 31 participants. Finally, self-knowledge was present in 25, it was expressed by 25 people. It had to do with the ability to deeply recognize self-dimensions at a relational, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, or spiritual level. And this was understood as facilitating conflict resolution. There were a large number of other less significant psychological processes that we could relate to a cognitive dimension that had to do with cognitive restructuring, exposure, an increase in self-esteem also. Other psychological processes were taking place that had to do with a predominantly emotional sphere. And here I would highlight the emotional release, or probably more closely to the psychodynamic model known as catharsis. And this has to do with a process where emotions are expressed using the body, mostly, for example, most common ways by crying very intensively. And this is not just an emotional experience or an emotional confrontation. This is a very intense level of experience of emotions that might have been repressed for a very long time. But other emotional processes were taking place, such as connection with oneself, gratitude, etc. In a less extensive way, other psychological processes that had to do more perhaps with evoking a spiritual dimension and spiritual connection were taking place, as well as connection with the body. So to finish, what I would highlight is that our study was able to demonstrate that the experience with ayahuasca was perceived as able to reduce symptoms, since it was offering people the skills to accept and cope with their emotions, with their actions, and with their reactions. So this was largely validated by people's experiences as they presented themselves. Another implication of the study is that the therapeutic potential of the ayahuasca experience can probably be translated in terms of psychological processes that are common to other more established and evidence-based treatments for anxiety, depression, complicated grief, or PTSD, as is commonly referred by cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic approaches, narrative therapies. So there is apparently a very common understanding of the underlying psychological processes that are responsible for such effects at a very common level. And to finish, even if more research around the psychological processes that are set in motion by the ayahuasca experience is still required, we believe that our results might contribute to understand the ayahuasca experience and to develop a solid body of evidence that shows effectiveness in levels that are parallel with other more established therapies. So this could actually be an important contribution for the normalization of the ayahuasca treatment, related treatment for different clinical diagnoses. So thank you very much.